The New Hollywood movement was a revolution for American cinema that introduced a new kind of liberation that changed what went on in the films and how it was conveyed. Lasting approximately from 1967 to 1980, its reverberations can be felt to this day as it prioritized the director and put a focus on modernity and realism over extravagance. It seemed this was an age when cinema grew up, with Hollywood making more adult-orientated movies which contained more adult-orientated themes as well as more violence, sex, drugs, and swearing.
I am the motherfucking Shore Patrol, motherfucker!
The New Hollywood movement was a response to an incredible change in the culture. Although the counterculture had affected music and fashion earlier, particularly in Britain, the film side of things took a little longer to apply, and this change in this medium had been a couple of decades in the making. The old Hollywood system ended in '48 when the Paramount antitrust case resulted in the major movie companies no longer holding exclusive rights to their cinemas, lowering their revenue and influence. Hollywood films sharply declined in the 50s. Cinema attendance had boomed in the post-war era, but dropped over the decades as consumers grew an increasing interest in television instead. Film companies could at least use television to sell film rights to, but that came to an abrupt stop in '68 as television had enough films to broadcast, another big financial blow to these companies. Hollywood competed with television by improving their technology, with most popular films being lavish and expensive productions made up of long-lasting genres like musicals, westerns, biblical films, and war films that were recently joined by popular franchise hits. But they were all having diminishing returns, and even high-grossing films weren't recuperating their ginormous budgets. This led to the disaster of 20th Century Fox's Cleopatra that cost them $39 million. Paramount also had trouble in '68 when they lost $65 to $70 million. While these companies suffered, Columbia did well initially throughout the '60s, but started to have problems later in the decade. These financial issues caused these companies to spend less on movie production, but offer more directorial control, which was spent on directors who wanted to more explicitly express their culture than ever before. There was much going on in the culture that made it shift and change so dramatically. Audiences wanted a more liberated cinema, and they got it, with Jack Valenti becoming MPAA president in '66, and he immediately began to loosen some restrictions on the archaic production code. Foreign films which featured more adult content often bypassed the production code, advertised with a For Adults seal. In Valenti's first week on the job, he ordered a complete overhaul of the production code, with the first American film to have this seal released just later in the year. The production code was completely abolished in '68, the MPAA replacing it with a rating system similar to what we have today, which immediately made films more open to sex, drugs, violence, and swearing.
I hate this motherfucking chicken shit eating.
This occurred in the same year the MPAA did a survey and discovered most cinema goers were aged 16 to 24. The American filmmakers of the '70s were very much inspired by the French New Wave filmmakers of the '60s, who they themselves were influenced by American filmmakers of the '40s, and it's from them that the auteur theory was developed, which is what prioritized the director as being the author of their film. These new directors had now grown up with television, and some even experimented with affordable home movie equipment. They either came from a background of TV directing, or from the growing film classes, or they had been apprenticed by Roger Corman, learning the technical details as they made low-budget schlock for his production house. There were a few films that were kicking off this movement, but the three big ones came out within 3 years of each other. Bonnie and Clyde, which depicted a more upfront view on violence and criminal characters, The Graduate, highly aimed at the young adult crowd and their own insular world, and Easy Rider, which took the popular biker genre and elevated it to something that was reflective of the hippie movement as well as the soon-to-be drug culture. Bonnie and Clyde was neglected upon release by its studio Warner Brothers, but it got enthusiastic reviews by the new wave of film critics emerging as well. These films and their immense successes paved the way for others like it. These filmmakers wanted to make films set in modern times, about modern topics, and with a more modern aesthetic.
The American people are turning sullen. They've been clobbered on all sides by Vietnam, Watergate, the inflation, the depression. They've turned off, shot up, and they fuck themselves limp, and nothing helps. So, this concept analysis report concludes the American people want somebody to articulate their rage for them.
Audiences were flocking to European movies like Blow Up, not just because it had very partial nudity, but because it put character and mood over story, being purposefully enigmatic and misleading in a gleeful manner, and also because it had partial nudity. This new young audience went against tradition and now wanted ambiguity in both the narratives and morality of these new films. The filmmakers were now inspired by documentaries and the cinema verite techniques of the French New Wave, so they didn't need to be too fancy. New cameras like the Arriflex and Panaflex were portable and made shooting on location even more practical, meaning less productions to be filmed on sound stages. This caused restrictions for the cinematographers that were channeled into an artistic blessing. This use of locations restricted camera movement, whereas films of previous decades could fill their master shots with characters as well as their surroundings. New Hollywood opted more on close-ups. Cinematographers appeared to be less fussy about lighting, going against the full and bright lighting style of the 50s and embracing the naturalistic shadows of their imagery, best exemplified in a studio film production, The Godfather. But in other films, this was a more incidental choice because lighting in real locations was more limited, causing more shadows and darkness. They now looked like color versions of the chiaroscuro lighted 40s noirs, though the cinematography was less constructed. Shooting seemed more off the cuff, with films employing cinema verite techniques from documentaries, such as filming their actors amongst actual events. The jaggedness of this kind of aesthetic had a sense of immediacy that matched the content. Studio-produced films were becoming cheaper to make and still generating a great profit, and independent filmmakers took this new kind of filmmaking liberty to its extremes, transferring their home movie expertise and bringing that rough aesthetic to the big screen. The counterculture of the Western world was being reflected in the films, becoming more ubiquitous in their depiction of sex, drugs, and violence. Influenced by the seeming ubiquity of sex, drugs, and violence in American culture, the first X-rated studio-released film actually managed to become a huge success, becoming the highest-grossing film of the year in the US, and even won the Oscar for Best Picture. After the Civil Rights Act of '64, black representation became more visible in the movies, with black actors playing far more characters rather than just bit players. Sidney Poitier paved the way, becoming the first black actor to earn an Oscar nomination before becoming the most bankable actor in Hollywood in '68. This led to the boom of the blaxploitation genre, which was fronted by Shaft and Sweet Sweetback's badass song. The new Hollywood movies also depicted an uneasiness and ambiguity, particularly in their endings, which was so unlike the Hollywood era before. Stories were no longer nicely tied up, they were mysterious, and uneasy strands still loomed, causing all sorts of other trouble off-screen after the film had ended. The time when the counterculture emerged was also the time when the American public's faith in the government began to dramatically drop, which continued throughout the decade, and the films made sure to reflect that. New Hollywood had not much interest in comforting audiences, but with addressing real-world issues in their own way. By 1972, Columbia lost millions on the kind of big-budget flops that were no longer popular. It seemed big genre movies like historical, fantasy, and sci-fi films weren't as popular as before, but only if they were set in the past or future. The modern-day set disaster movies were the new genre to take that place in Hollywood's more bombastic production value arena. Hollywood was still in a habit of advancing their technology to compete with television. Although it was British musical film Lisztomania that first utilized Dolby Stereo, it was Apocalypse Now that introduced to the cinemas the surround sound experience that is Dolby 5.1. The box office grosses that were at their lowest since the post-war era had in just 3 years now become the highest since the post-war era. Despite New Hollywood arguably hitting a creative high towards the middle of the decade, it was also the time when studios started to regard these grosses over quality content again. The end of the New Hollywood movement had been pondered upon before it began, when in '67 the studios considered the notion of summer blockbusters, which seemed to be a popular moviegoer time when students and workers were on holiday. It was the exhibition method of The Godfather that changed the distribution of films forever. Previously, films opened in just a few cinemas in New York and LA, before later gradually expanding to more and more, but The Godfather opened wide in the US, playing in a whopping 316 cinemas in its first couple of weeks. This method was as great a financial decision as Columbia could hope for, with The Godfather becoming the highest grossing film at the time in just 6 months. Studios felt that flooding a film into cinemas across the nation was the way to go, particularly with a big advertising budget that was more cost effective with a wide release. Universal employed this advertising and distribution method with Jaws, with an unprecedented $1.8 million spent on advertising, and released it nationally to 409 cinemas at once. It too quickly became the highest grossing film ever, and this new wide release method has since become the norm for what's now known as tentpole films, or blockbusters, which now get released simultaneously in thousands of cinemas across the country, and plenty more around the world. Audiences started to regress back to films promoting old values, as popularized by American Graffiti, Jaws, Rocky, and Star Wars. whose successes led to a new age of sequelitis that hasn't gone away since. The box office seemed to suggest audiences wanted feel-good films with unambiguous clarity and happy endings that were more entertaining than edifying. New Hollywood filmmakers were beginning to crash and burn as they increased the budget of their personal auteur films, whose commercial failures suggested they had gotten too big. Even Apocalypse Now, enormously successful both critically and commercially, was still regarded as a warning for what happens when a director's ego creates chaos in a film's production. The successful directors of the 70s burnt out much quicker than directors of previous generations. Even though blockbuster filmmaking took over in the 80s with a slew of action films, the new Hollywood spirit never seemed to truly go away. There were still some adult-orientated films in the new decade, but it really started to flourish once again with the independent scene of the 90s. The new Hollywood movement that began in the late 60s can still be felt today, and not just in American films, meaning this incredible influence has sustained through time and traveled globally, making it one of the most significant moments in cinema history.